Hi, class. Welcome to Chapter 19. We're going to be discussing in this chapter the 15th century art in Northern Europe and the international style. So you should have in front of you the handout for 15th century art in Northern Europe, also, which also known as our Chapter 19 handout, which you can find on our timeline session. Let's talk about late Gothic and then the beginning of the international Gothic style in Europe. The area that we're going to be focusing on primarily for this chapter is this area right here in purple. It's actually convenient that it's this color, that it's relatively a purple color, because the area right here is known as Burgundy. Burgundy is close to purple, so you can remember it that way. The reason why we're looking primarily at Burgundy, we're going to see, is that even though France is growing as a kingdom, the area of Burgundy is really where most of the money in Northern Europe is. Florence and Venice were big trading cities and city-states as well, but up here, these cities like Ghent, which we're going to study, Antwerp, which we're going to study, Bruges, where we're going to look for a while, all of these cities in Burgundy were really the wealthy cities in northern France, wealthy trading cities. And as such, the people who were running them are going to be sort of the trendsetters for most of the rest of Europe. So that's why we're going to look at Burgundy. To set up a little bit of the historical context, the late Gothic world was a world of plague and war, to put it nicely. The 14th century, which we just got out of, we finished talking about the Black Death. Hopefully you remember from our last chapter where we covered the Black Death. Kind of sent waves through Europe. It didn't just stop in 1348. It kind of kept coming back every summer. That's kind of the bad thing about the plague, is it sort of blossoms under warm weather, and then it will go dormant over the winter, and then it will come back in the warm weather again. You have also on your list the Hundred Years' War. 1337 to 1453 was a war between England and France. We don't really have to get into too much detail about why or what was going on. It was a lot of family and noblemen disagreeing with each other and that kind of thing. It was a war basically that lasted 100 years. Bottom line is, I want you guys to remember that France and England do not like each other. France, however, is picking all sorts of battles during this transition from the 14th to the 15th century. France also has a bone to pick with Italy, more specifically the papal states down here, right? Rome is not on this map, but it should be right there. That's Rome on the Tiber River. This is the century that they incur and engage in the Great Schism, which was religious dissent between France and Italy. It's a really long story, but the main gist was the French clergymen had been infiltrating the high echelons of the papacy for a long time. And not just any French clergymen, these were French clergymen who were loyal to the king in France, kind of above the Italian the Italian agenda in Italy. And so they're going to kind of side with France on any decision that the King of France wants to make. And they start to infiltrate higher and higher. The Pope eventually that they elect during a sort of gridlocked papal election, they elect a French Pope. And the Italians were not happy about them electing a French Pope. The French Pope was also not very happy about being in Italy surrounded by all of these sort of perceived enemies. The guy who was the Pope before him, I don't remember his name, but he died mysteriously after only 8 months in office, so he kind of wasn't feeling good about being in Rome, in Italy at all at that point. And so Clement, who was the Pope at the time, he decides to not move to Rome, and he sets up his own papal states over here in Avignon in the south of France. And you can tell that being in the south of France, he's going to side with the King of France for most of these decisions, and he's going to remain protected. Well, the Italians didn't like that. They didn't like not having a pope on their territory, and they didn't like not having a pope who was loyal to sort of the Italian way of doing things. And so they elect themselves a new pope, and there's two popes, and it's just a mess. People don't know who to listen to, and, the everyday, Catholic citizen is just, I'm just trying to achieve salvation, and they don't know who to listen to. But again, main gist is France is also not getting along with Italy. Great schism, war between France and Italy, war between France and England, all sorts of stuff going on. Now, the fact that these countries are at war for hundreds of years, and in the case of the Great Schism, it's a little under 100 years, but it doesn't mean that they were going into battle every day of that 100 years. It just means that there was a lot of political tension, and there would be a battle sort of maybe every couple of years or so. It doesn't mean that they were fighting constantly. Obviously, that would leave both of their populations completely destroyed. So they use the term war loosely. Okay, we're seeing a more capitalistic and widespread system of continental trade. And because of that, this sort of continental trade that's going on, so meaning that it's sort of between not only the European countries, kingdoms, what have you, but elsewhere as well, coming from the other lands of the Mediterranean, farther north, and well, even as far as the Americas at some point, very soon, they're going to invent the use of money. It seems silly that it kind of really took this long. I mean, the Romans kind of had money, and money had been used up until this point, but it really was not until the 14th century into the 15th century that people started using money very exclusively as exchange, instead of like, I'm sending you this many caskets of wine and you're sending me this many sheep, right? It was much more money. And with the development and the widespread use of money, and also, I should say, a controlled currency that they're using, right? Because there is now one currency that they were using. They begin to open up things like banks, right, and trading firms. So banking families are going to, and trading families are going to make themselves a lot of money during this time. For the example, we're going to talk about the Medicis in the next chapter. I know we kind of hinted at them last time. With this also comes the invention of the first stock exchange, which was located in Antwerp, right here, which is in modern-day Belgium. And this first stock exchange began in 1460. I guess the significance between all of this trade and stock exchange and widespread use of currency and banking, what I'm really trying to get to you guys, or get across to you guys, is that there's a significant amount of the population, urban population, that are wealthy, and that are earning their own money through trade, through banking, through what have you, and they're not just born into it. So this idea of the self-made man, which I believe we talked about in our last chapter, is going to be just as important in the North, right? People are now able to sort of create their own fate. So people are earning their money, not just born into it. Also, a lot of the rural population is moving to these urban centers. They don't need as many people out in the farms, and so a lot of people are going to move to these urban centers and try to join guilds or work in workshops. Both of those things we talked about last time. This time period is going to value hard work. It's going to value, well, sort of value modesty. We'll see that that's not always true. They're definitely going to value, however, education. And but in the same sense, they're going to have an affinity for fashion and for imported goods. That's sort of a product of them being a good trading town. So the time period is going to value hard work, modesty, and education. A lot of this sort of new sort of low middle class are going to value those things, but there is also going to be a very extravagantly wealthy upper class who we're gonna talk about them. Those are the Dukes of Burgundy, and they're going to be, as I said, the fashion setters, the trend setters, and we're also going to see a lot of imported goods. So because it's up here in Belgium, this is a center for trade, they're doing a lot of importing. religion is ruling the land. At this point, it's Catholicism, no questions asked. That's the religion that everybody is. There might be some, stray members of other religions floating around, but for the most part, it's Catholicism. They're not really interested in humanism, so we're not really going to call this a renaissance because this is not a rebirth of the ancient ideals. But they do sort of gain an interest in realistic still life studies, so kind of done in exhaustive detail. That's one characteristic of the what we're going to call the International Gothic style, is the term for this time period. Here's another map. It's a little bit more detailed than the one that you're looking at here. You can see this is a region of Burgundy. This is also part of Burgundy. And we're going to talk about some of these Burgundian kings. Oh, sorry about that, guys. You can also see a little bit better in this map how there is a river that travels down through this. And actually, there are rivers that travel all the way through Europe that start up here in these deltas of Holland and Flanders. We're going to talk about Flanders for a while, and of course, the actual territory of Burgundy. So, really, whoever runs this land has really easy connection through these rivers to the rest of Europe, which is why this is going to be such a hub for trade. We start to see more names during this. We have more names of artists in the 15th century than we have in the entire Common Era leading up to the 15th century. So it sort of goes hand in hand with the development of guilds comes the development of artists, as we talked about in the last session. The cities that are on these rivers are sometimes below sea level. You may have seen or heard of the canals of Venice. Well, the canals of Bruges, Netherlands, Antwerp, and Ghent's not on here, but it should be, were just as famous. And so when you went to these cities, just like Venice, you can see that they are placed alongside the canals. So you can, back in the old days, you could just travel by boat through the city. You could also travel on land, but it would actually take longer, and you can dock your boat right outside one of these restaurants and get in through the door, which is kind of cool. So this is a picture from Bruges, taken from the canal on a boat tour. Why do I have this on here? Oh, I want to talk a little bit about Gothic art in France. I didn't really get a good chance to talk about this last time, and we haven't really covered it because this is art history too. But Gothic art in France was dominated by these, huge Gothic cathedrals, and these huge Gothic cathedrals featured lots and lots of stained glass. And so I just wanted to show this as an example of the stained glass, which was everywhere in these Gothic cathedrals. You can see some of the dominant colors I really want to point out to you being red and blue, which kind of give off this purple tone, but if you look closely, there actually isn't any purple. It just kind of looks purple because there's a lot of red and blue. Highlights of yellow, sometimes green, but for the most part just red and blue. And I just wanted to point that out because we see this dominance of red and blue work its way. Oh, here's another example of the stained glass architecture. You see just how much they loved their stained glass. This is 60 feet tall stained glass lancet windows from a Gothic cathedral called Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, which we cover in Art History 1. The proclivity towards red and blue works its way into manuscript decoration in the 13th century, moving into the late 13th century, early 14th century, and even continues into our first starred slide. So the dominance of red and blue, you can see here, is coming from a long-standing tradition of stained glass. However, this is not stained glass. This is an example of a manuscript. If you have never heard of the term manuscript, I should define it for you now. A manuscript is anything really that was written by hand. So manus is the Latin word for hand. It's where we get the word manicure. And script is the word for writing, right? Script just makes sense. Scribe, for example. So manuscript is something that was written by hand. The manuscripts that we're going to be referring to for the most part are these book manuscripts from the 15th century. This is one example. They are not written on paper. Paper has been invented, but it has not made its way to Europe yet. It takes a really long time to get to Europe from China, where it's slowly making its way over. The Arab nations, the Islamic Empire is using it, but the rest of Europe has not quite caught on. Instead of using paper, they're using parchment or vellum. Parchment or vellum are calf skin and animal skin. So what you do is you take a calf skin and you stretch it really, really far, farther than you would for leather, but you bake it in the sun the same way. You dry it out, you shave off all of the hairs, and then after this sort of really long stretching process, it's ready to get cut up into pieces of paper. What's kind of crummy about using animal skin is if the animal has any wounds, it'll stretch out and you'll have lots of holes in your parchment because it starts out as a really small wound, but as you stretch it, the hole gets bigger and bigger. You'll also find hairs on it every now and then, which is kind of gross. You'll be reading through a manuscript and you'll see like little pieces of hair are still attached. Also, it's very expensive because you only get, maybe 10 to 15 small folios, they would call sheets of paper, well, sheets of parchment, small folios from a sheep. Now that's just an approximation. I've never done it myself, so I don't exactly know how many. But you really don't get that much parchment for your per animal. So the bigger your manuscript was, the more expensive it was. Manuscripts would and have featured manuscript decoration or illustration for about 1,000 years. They've been illustrating their manuscripts, so nearly 1,000 years. Most manuscripts just get small sort of details or pictures in the margins. It's only very, very expensive and important books, we would call them codexes, important codexes that get full-size page decoration within them. So we know that whoever's book this is, the January, the Tres Vichers de Duc de Berry, is an important guy, a very wealthy guy. So this is the Duc de Berry. You can see his name right here in French. It's D-U-C in French. He was one of these Burgundian dukes, one of these trendsetters, one of these very, very wealthy relations to the king. Some of them were his brother. I think the Duke of Berry was his younger brother. He commissions the Limburg brothers for his personal Book of Hours. So that's what we're looking at here. A Book of Hours, we kind of covered it last time, was a small personal devotional prayer book full of specific prayers to that person. It's much smaller than much smaller than carrying around the entire Bible. Actually, this is an example of, if you look right here at this guy's little purse, his pocketbook, this is a Book of Hours that's in his man purse. It's a satchel. Anyway, so they would wrap them up and wear them tied around their waist like that. So this is for his Book of Hours. It's significant that he's commissioning the Limburg brothers for his Book of Hours because it's in the 15th century that they develop a guild for manuscript writing. Up until this point, manuscripts had been written exclusively by monks in monasteries, but now it's a secular, meaning not affiliated with the church guild. So the Limburg brothers are going to, they're not religious. They're copying religious texts, but they're not clergy members themselves, and so they kind of get away with certain things that maybe a clergy member would not do, but we'll talk about that later. So if you're following along with your handout, Jean de Berry is Duc de Berry, so it's Duke Jean de Berry. That's his name. He's from Berry. His name is Jean, and he's a duke. He has money. He has power. He has 12 palaces, and as I said, he's the main arbiter of international style. And here is the Duc de Berry. That's him right there. You can tell that that's the Duc de Berry because he is the largest figure in the room. So whenever you're looking for the most important guy, look for the biggest. Odds are you'll be looking in the right direction. Yes, I'm sorry, he was the king. He was the brother of the King of France. We are seeing a new sort of presentation of space in these 15th century manuscripts. What we're looking at here is kind of an attempt at being a window into this room. So the Duc de Berry is having a party. You can probably tell by the lavishly set table, surrounded by all sorts of noblemen around him, and his super fancy dress. Yes, he's throwing a party. This is a page from the calendar session or section of his Book of Hours. So at the end of his Book of Hours, there was an illustrated calendar, and this was representational of the month of January. Apparently, in January, the Duc de Berry would have a feast or a party, and so this is that party. So that's what they're showing right here. We see a continuation of the international style that we covered in the last chapter, the 14th century international style, in the international Gothic interest in wealth and riches, right? We really do see that continuing. Duc de Berry has spared no expense for this party, and the Limburg brothers are going out of their way to capture all of his expensive material goods in excruciating detail. You see a table set with imported and expensively prepared foods. You see this table back here, full of gold vessels that really aren't doing anything. They're kind of there just to show how much money he has. Hanging in the back off the wall, these are examples of tapestries. One time I taught this class and someone asked me why the Duc de Berry was coming under attack. It's actually an interesting sort of spatial illusion that the Limburg brothers have captured. This is a tapestry with a picture of the Battle of Troy going on in the background, and so it's a picture of a battle, not an actual battle where they're attacking the people. We're going to look at an example of a tapestry. There are cloth hangings that sort of drape off the wall. You can see where they're pinned up here along the top, and they provide insulation in cold weather and kindling for fire. These were just basically, arson's nightmare or arson's dream waiting to happen, because they catch on fire and the whole wall goes down. But anyway, they're there for insulation and for decoration. Also very expensive. So again, showing just how wealthy he is. Again, we are getting here a view into this party, and we're being presented it. They're not staring out at us. We are witnessing the party in action. Is it realistic? No. The international style is known for a couple of things. Number one, they do not have any sort of appreciation for human proportions. So these sort of naturalistic proportions that are part of the humanism from the Greek world that we covered last section, they're not going to have any interest in that. So human proportions, no. Contrapposto, absolutely not. In fact, much closer to a S-curve, maybe, than a contrapposto. The figures are long, kind of thin, wearing lots of bulky but very fashionable clothes. Another aspect of the international Gothic style, another characteristic, would be their use of what we can kind of call intuitive perspective. Intuitive perspective, I think it's on your list there, is, here's intuitive perspective. In general, perspective is the idea that things get smaller as they get further away. That's a really sort of easy way to describe it. Anything that's far away gets small. Intuitive perspective is the idea that, yes, things get smaller as they get further away, but we're not going to actually take the time to calculate how small they get. We're just kind of going to guess at it. So they don't spend a lot of time calculating or preparing, how small things should be when they recede. They just kind of wing it. They use their intuition. That's where the term comes from. And they also don't use any sort of proper horizon line or vanishing point, which we'll see when we cover Italian Renaissance art. They start using that. So you can see that this table is kind of vanishing in this direction, whereas this architectural background, I think it's a fireplace, is receding in that direction. It's just kind of all wonky. If you ever take a drawing class, this is not how you're supposed to draw perspective. So that's intuitive perspective. However, some of the detail is rendered with pretty good detail. Details has good detail. The still life aspect, the cloth, the food that's on the table, that's all rendered in very, very good, minute, I should say, detail, because this page is quite small. It's under a foot. I know that for sure. Probably under, I think under 7 inches or so. Because again, remember these would have to be very small so that they could be portable. You can tell that this is January, not just because they're having a party, and apparently the Duc de Berry would have a party every January, but because of the astrological signs up here in the sky. This is Capricorn, leaving, waning Capricorn, and I think that's Aquarius or Aries. I apologize. I don't know anyone who's born in late January, so I'm not sure what the astrological sign. Maybe one of you guys know, and you can write about it in the forum as things that I get wrong in my lecture. The Lindbergh brothers created full-scale illustrations for every month out of the year. So again, this is January, and here is February. And this is what I mean by the Lindbergh brothers getting away with a little bit more than monks would have been able to get away with. So here's February. Again, you can see that intuitive perspective. Things are kind of wonky. They're kind of receding into space, but going in several different directions, and it doesn't really make any logical sense. It's not really rational, as you would say, if you were talking about Italian Renaissance art. Over here, you see that we're not looking at a table or a castle of the Duc de Berry. Instead, in February, we're looking at some of his noble and happy peasants. So he's such a good lord that his peasants are happy to work hard for him, and so that they can pay him homage and pay him, well, taxes, really. And so, yeah, the Duc de Berry is looking here at some of his noble peasants, but that's not kind of without a sort of subtle snobbery or irony, because he is still above them. Yes, they're noble, hardworking peasants. They work, even in snowy conditions. They're still bringing stuff to, into the city to trade. They're still chopping wood. They're still tending the bees. These are bees. They're making honey for mead. Love mead. But then when they do go inside, they're in such a rush to warm themselves up, and they're such vulgar peasants that they sit down in front of the fire and expose their genitalia. So if you look down here, there's a phallus. This is a woman doing the same thing. And so the Duc de Berry would have gotten a good laugh at that. He would have looked at it and gone, oh, haha, those vulgar peasants, they can't even keep their skirts down. So yes, he's proud of his noble peasants, but it's not without a certain amount of snobbery. Also, another characteristic of the International Gothic style is that people are usually far too big in relation or in perspective to buildings, right? So these people are far too big for this building, except for out here where they're, kind of small. Actually, no, this is far too small for that woman, right? If you're looking at these sheep. And nature is also usually too small compared to people. So we see an intuitive perspective. We've seen sort of long, unnaturalistic looking figures. We see buildings that are way too big for the people. We see an interest in gold, sumptuous materials, right? Being very sort of materialistic, similar to the International Gothic or International style of the last century. But then we also see an excruciating amount of attention to detail and still life. So hopefully this is all starting to make sense. Philip the Bold was another one of these Burgundian dukes. He was another one of these fashionable dukes, and he was also a great art patron. He donated this monastery, Chartreuse de Champmont, in Dijon, which was part of Burgundy. This specific monastery was a was a particularly expensive monastery because it was for Carthusian monks. The Carthusian monks, if you're not familiar, they devote their lives entirely to solitary living and to prayer. So unlike other monks, who are people who devote themselves entirely to their religion, in this case Christianity, in other monasteries you would find monks doing things like farming, harvesting crops, building, running hospitals, running schools. They worked. And some monasteries were completely self-sustaining. A Carthusian monastery, which is what you're looking at here, what Philip the Bold has donated, costs a lot of money because they don't do anything. As I said, the monks devote themselves entirely to solitary living and prayer, so they're not contributing, they're not paying for anything, and so he has to fit the entire bill, and he has to kind of support it, and his family has to support it for the rest of their lives. A monastery, if this is the first time you're hearing the term, hopefully it isn't, but a monastery is kind of like a religious fraternity, or sorority, depending if you're a monk or a nun. It's a place where monks would go to live apart from society, and devote their lives to prayer. Philip the Bold would be ensuring his own sort of piety and salvation with this type of donation. You donate a monastery and you're pretty securely, according to the Catholic Church at the time, going to get in heaven. He also wanted to show his support for Avignon by telling the artist, Klaus Luder, to include a lot of images of Mary right here. This is called the trumeau, also called the door jamb of the doors or the portal into these churches. They're choosing Mary here specifically instead of St. Peter. St. Peter is the patron of the Catholic papacy. In most of the Christian traditions, he's considered the first pope. Christ calls him the evangelist that he's going to build his church upon, and so they believe that he was the first pope, although he didn't really go by that while he was alive. Also, the pope, or the royal, sorry, not royal, sorry, the papal palaces and St. Peter's Basilica are built right on top of where they believed St. Peter was buried. So St. Peter died in Rome. That's why the Vatican, also St. Peter's Basilica, is located in Rome, outside the walls on the cemetery spot where they believe that St. Peter was located, where his body might have been. St. Peter's, Rome is all about St. Peter. They love him. The fact that in France they're going to start to choose Mary over St. Peter is a really significant and telling thing, and it just kind of goes to show just how much they really hated each other. It doesn't seem like much, but the Pope in Rome, or the papacy in Rome, would have seen this as a pretty big middle finger, the fact that they're using Mary instead. This is the fountain. It's called the Well of Moses from Chartreuse de Champmol. It's the Carthusians would be silent, right? They didn't speak. They took vows of silence, and so this would kind of be. It was supposed to be a fountain, but the monks didn't want it to be a fountain because it was too noisy. So it just kind of became a well. So it doesn't really make any noise. So it's not technically a fountain. It's technically a well. And here you've got Moses, which is a reference to the biblical story. We don't have to talk about this for too long. I just really want to point out the fact that these statues have traces of paint on them, and we think that this would have been for all of these exterior statues. They would have had paint. Oh, I wanted to have this after the next slide. Oh, it's okay. We'll talk about this first, and then we'll move back. Sorry. This is an example of a typical altarpiece. So we covered the Maesta altarpiece in our last chapter. That was just sort of one, it was many panels that make up one altarpiece, but they were all connected and attached. Many altarpieces, especially in the north, would have two or more movable parts to them. And so that's what you're looking at here. So you're looking here at an example of a polyptych, which means it's an altarpiece that has many wings. Poly means many, and tic is referring to the amount of wings or panels that it possesses. And so here's the central, that's one, and then here's one on the, on your right side, and then one on your left side, and you can close it and you can open it. And these two movable parts, totaling in three, right? So 1, 2, 3 means that this is a polyptych and also a triptych. Now this is really the kind of the confusing part, because it can be a polyptych and a triptych. Poly just means many, right? Triptych comes from the word tri, which means three. So triptych, if it has three, it's a triptych. If it has two, like this one right here, just two wings total, it's a diptych. Di means two. Tri means three. And then once you get beyond three, we just call it a polyptych because we don't feel like going through all of the numbers that way. But both of these are also technically polyptychs. Hopefully you guys are kind of following along. Poly just means many, try to, die 3. So you can just count how many panels there are, and that can help you. So these are 2 of the outer wings of one of these polyptychs. I believe it was at one point a triptych, but we're missing one of the panels. And the artist here, Broderlam, created these 2 panels for the same monastery, Chartreuse de Chaumont, that we just looked at. Don't really have too much time to get into these 2 scenes because I'm already kind of falling behind on my schedule, but you can see a couple more. We'll just reiterate some of the examples of the international Gothic style figures, right, that are too large for their background, right here in this supposedly Gothic looking church that they're standing in, and they're halfway up the walls. Background as well. A landscape that is done in sort of very meticulous and interesting detail, but the perspective again is wonky. The lines here do not line up and create a linear perspective. It's called intuitive perspective, and the figures do not have naturalistic body proportions or even really attention to their body underneath their robes. However, you see some great detail in things like architectural rendering right here, and small birds up here in the background. Yeah, this is an Annunciation scene, which we've seen before. Looks, different from the one that we studied from Simone Martini in some ways, but also very similar in others. Again, we have a Mary who's sitting on a throne, not in a barn. She has a halo and a lovely robe and a very expensive book that she's reading, and all of that stuff that's inaccurate about the story. And then this, it's hard to tell because her robes are so bulky, but she is standing in an S-curve position right here. Let's talk about some Burgundian princesses, specifically Mary of Burgundy. This is another book of hours, and you're looking at it blown up on your screen quite large. But if you see the size right here, 7.5 by 5 inches. This is a really, really small manuscript illumination page that you're seeing. So just try to keep that in mind when you look at this detail, and it starts to hit home really what I mean when I say that this detail is rendered in astonishing accuracy. Okay. So this is the book of a page from the Book of Hours created for Mary of Burgundy. This is Mary of Burgundy right here. She was the daughter of Charles the Bold, so the daughter of the guy who paid for the Carthusian monastery that we just studied. She is it's actually kind of an interesting study in the way that people would have seen these Book of Hours, because she's looking at her Book of Hours in which on the page she is reading her Book of Hours. So that's kind of, there's her looking at a Book of Hours in a picture of her looking at her Book of Hours. In the manuscript page, however, this Mary of Burgundy is being such a good and devoted good girl that she's being gifted with a visitation and vision, which is taking place through this window. So here's Mary of Burgundy again. This is a second Mary of Burgundy. Same one, but this is her vision, where she gets to see and understand and maybe even have some sort of direct prayer to Mary. So she's here reading very well, and she's reading as a good girl, and she's being given a vision of herself where she gets to meet Mary. This sort of would have provided incentive for the real Mary who's reading the book to keep reading and to keep at her work, because maybe she'll get a vision just as she did as she's doing in this picture. I love Mary's outfit. I just want to put it on and go to a Renaissance fair. I don't know if you guys feel the same way as I do. But this hat and then this sheer gauze material that comes down over her hair is just so intricately and sort of meticulously detailed, and you can really get a sense. It's very hard to paint or draw something sheer. I mean, I've never tried it. I don't think that I could, but to get it like that and actually have it look like sheer cloth is fantastic. She's wearing velvet and fur. She has her very expensive Book of Hours. She's covered in jewelry. She's got this really big forehead that they loved in the 15th century. I don't know. We're recreating our period eye, right? This big. They were all about big foreheads. In fact, some of the women used to shave the tops of their hair across their forehead to make themselves look like they had bigger foreheads. Yeah, I don't know why. I don't see it. They had like 7 heads, right? Talk about 5 heads, 4 heads, 5 heads. They had 7. She's surrounded by another thing that is a very strong characteristic of Northern Renaissance art, and that is symbolism. They love signs and symbols. It's really fun when you learn how to read these paintings to be able to decipher some of these signs and symbols. One of those signs right here is her little doggie that's sitting on her lap. A dog is always a sign for fidelity. Dogs are loyal creatures, and so whenever you see a dog next to somebody or with somebody, you know that that person is a loyal person. So she's supposed to be encouraged to be loyal with this little dog here of fidelity. The term Fido, if you ever called a dog Fido, it comes from fidelity. Dogs are loyal. She has a rosary here, very expensive, so she's very wealthy. It's another example of this sort of symbolism. Let's see. And then the presence of the book showing that she's a very pious woman. The irises right here are for Mary's sorrow. They're representative of, right, the sort of purple, these purple dark flowers are representative of what's going to happen to this Mary and her child, right? We kind of know what's happening if you understand the story. So those are a couple of these signs and symbols. We're going to see them really take off by the end of this chapter. So she's another Burgundian princess, and this is her very small but very wonderfully rendered Book of Hours. This vision in this church behind her, right? This church probably isn't behind this window. This is the spiritual world, and this is supposed to be her real world in front of the window. But this is a vision that she's having. Separation of sacred space. It's very important for her, for you to understand sacred space versus what's supposed to be rendered as realistic space. I love that she has a different outfit in the background too, and she's also again in this very sort of S-curve position. Body is way too big for the architecture that they're in, all that good stuff. This is an example of a tapestry. I told you guys we were going to look at one. It's a cloth. It's huge. This is 12 feet by 12 feet. So would have covered the entire expanse of one of their walls, at least the lower portion of it. And yes, would have provided insulation. It's a textile. It's woven. So these are threads woven to create a pattern or design. In this case, a fantastic story full of figural representation, animals, people, different emotions, people standing in different positions and with different facial features. It's really, really well done. It would have been part of a whole series called the Unicorn Tapestries, which are located in the cloisters in New York. So if you ever find yourself in New York and want to go see a museum with lots and lots of really good medieval and late medieval art, go to the cloisters, because the whole series is right there. It tells a story of a unicorn hunt. A unicorn, here, if you don't know, this is a unicorn. It's a horse with a horn on its head, usually shown as white. They're associated with sort of purity and virginity. In fact, the only way to catch a unicorn is to use a virgin as bait. You set a trap with a virgin in it, and the unicorn will come because it will be attracted to the virgin's purity, and then you can catch that unicorn. Unicorn hunts were one of these quests that were very, very popular. A very, very popular feat of valor performed by these knights who were big during the 15th century. The knights, Knights. And in the knights, you had to be knighted, you had to usually come from noble or rich family, you had to have your own armor, and then you had to be sort of given your knighthood. And most of these orders, most of these they're kind of like knight fraternities. They're kind of like knight fraternities. Most of them you had to take a vow of celibacy, and you were supposed to protect the innocent, and you were supposed to save damsels in distress, and you were supposed to go on quests. And so that's what they are doing here. This is a bunch of knights that are going on this quest to hunt a unicorn. In this case, they were successful, and they found a unicorn, and they're going to kill it. I'm sorry, sad to give it away, but they're going to kill that poor unicorn. And then, other popular quests were for things like the Holy Grail. You might have heard of that. The knight lore, the mythology of the knight, was very strongly present up in the north. You may have also heard of other knights like King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. That story was really very popular. So stories about knights were popular up here, whereas in Italy, they like to show scenes of stories of gods and goddesses. So the gods and goddesses of Greece and Rome never really made it this far north. I mean, they'd heard the stories, but they prefer this sort of knight culture as opposed to Greek, the Greek pantheon.